Suffice it to say, this too is not the best design because you certainly don't want to make a web application where your users, to provide user input, have to manually edit the URL. That would be like searching for Google by only being able to edit the URL by adding /search q equals cats anytime you want to search for cats, let alone some other value. And certainly if you want to type in your email address or a credit card number or anything that we're in the habit of typing into forms on the web, you don't want to have to manually do that instead in the URL. Which is to say, how can we make this now a more typical web application that still takes user input, but takes it via a proper web form? We saw how to make forms last week. For instance, we made a front end for Google. Let's now implement the back ends thereof. So let me go back over to VS Code here now, and let me propose that we will create an actual form in index.html. So index.html's purpose in life is no longer to be a template that says hello, comma, so-and-so. All it's going to display is a template. So let me go ahead and delete this line here, and let me delete this use of a placeholder, and let me go into index.html and remove the body here that we had for that placeholder. And let's actually now, in this here body, create a web form. So I'm going to do form, and then inside of the form tag, I'm going to create an input. And the name of that input is going to be name, because I want the human's name. And the type of that text, the type of that input is going to be text, even though that's the implied default. But recall from last time, there's some nice features I can enable. Anytime I make a form, I can turn off autocomplete, so it doesn't remember the previous person's name. I can auto focus that input so that the cursor is blinking and ready to go. And so that the human knows what to do with it, I can say placeholder equals quote unquote name, so that there's little gray text that's explanatory text. Now notice there's some potential confusion here. My use of name here is to define the name of the HTTP parameter that I do want to end up in the URL. The name here is the name of the HTML attribute that it comes with the input tag if you want to use it. Placeholder here is another attribute that can be used with the input element. So even though we're seeing lots of names and lots of placeholders, they're the same idea, but they mean different things in different contexts. Now we're looking at HTML alone. All right, besides that input field, let me go ahead and create a button. The type of this button is going to be submit, so it knows to submit this form. And I'm going to have that button say greet, so it's obvious that I click on this button to greet that person's name. All right, what more do I need in here? Well, this is just a form, which is fine visually, but I haven't told the browser where to submit it just yet. And if I don't specify that, it's actually going to submit back to the same URL, for instance, /, if that's what's serving this up. So if I actually want to change the action that the browser should really take, there turns out there is indeed an action attribute, which allows me to specify where I'm submitting this. And I'm not going to submit it to Google, for instance, this week. I'm instead going to submit it to my very own route, which doesn't yet exist, but it will in a moment, /greet. And the method I want to use is going to be specifically get, where in contrast with post, because I do want to use get so that the parameters very visibly appear in the URL, if only so that I can show you what's happening. If I were to use post instead, recall, that sort of hides the input, still in the envelope, but sort of more deeply inside of it, so it's not exposed in the URL, which is appropriate for anything personal, maybe an email address, maybe a credit card number, a password, or the like. But this is just a person's name, so I'm OK for now with revealing it in the URL. All right, let's now go back to my other tab. If I delete the URL parameters there and hit enter and go back to my default template, I see indeed a form asking for a name and a button to greet someone. So I'm going to type in my name, David, and I'm going to click greet. And notice what happens to the URL at top. It does automatically bring me to /greet ? Name equals David. So I, the human, did not need to type all of that in as I have been. The browser knows when submitting a form via get, do that. Unfortunately, I get a 404 not found. Why? Because my app.py file only has one route for /. There is no route yet for /greet. So I think we can fix that too by just practicing what I've been preaching here as follows. Let's go into app.py and say app.route, quote unquote, /greet. And here too, I could call it anything I want, but I want parity with what I just put in my form. And inside of this, under this decorator, so to speak, I now need to specify exactly what function I want to be called when this route is visited. I can call this function anything I want, but to keep myself sane, I'm going to use a name for the function that kind of matches the route itself. So I'm going to call this function greet, even though it can be anything I want. And then after this function, which is not going to take any arguments, I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to say in here, name equals request.args.get, quote unquote, name, to get the value of the name parameter from the get string. But if there's no such value there, let's grab a default value of world. And then, as before, I'm going to return the return value of render template, but this time I'm going to render a different template that, to be fair, does not yet exist, but I can solve that problem too, greet.html, and I'm going to pass into that template, once it exists, the value of name equaling the value of that variable. So same ideas as before, but I've now moved a lot of my logic into a brand new function and route called greet. All right, so what's now going to happen here? Well, let me go back to my browser, which previously was 404 not found because the route didn't even exist. I'm going to click reload, and I'm going to see a new problem, I think, because the route exists, but I don't think that template exists, greet.html yet. So let me hit enter, reload, and now I've got an internal server error, which, welcome to web programming. This is going to be the new segmentation fault of C, but in the context of web programming. When you see 500 internal server error, as much as you might like to hope otherwise, it is your fault. You have made a mistake somewhere, as I just did. So let's see how to diagnose this. Let me go back to my other tab. Let me reopen my terminal window, and thankfully, within my terminal window, I should see, among any number of other errors, some hint as to what went wrong. So to be clear, when you see a 500 error in your browser, internal server error, 1, it's your fault. But 2, there's probably diagnostically useful hints in your terminal window. If you've created 2 terminal windows, that's fine. You have to realize that your commands are going to be left alone. You have to go back to your other terminal window where Flask run is still running, and you might want to scroll up and down, look at the most recent error in there, and hopefully you'll see something useful. And indeed, I do think I do. Template not found, greet.html. And that's pretty much hitting the nail on the head and telling me exactly what there is wrong. But interestingly, we haven't seen this word yet, Jinja exceptions. Exceptions we've seen before, and you might recall that we can try to do something, but if an error happens, an exception might indeed be raised. Jinja, though, is a new term, and this is just referring to another library that anyone on the internet can use, but the folks who invented Flask decided to adopt this other library themselves called Jinja. And what Jinja is essentially a templating library. Its purpose in life is just to handle everything inside of that templates directory. So if I go back to my own index.html, it is technically a library called Jinja that is reading that template top to bottom, left to right, looking for, among other things, pairs of curly braces so that Jinja can do the substitution for you. Now, why is Flask using Jinja? Well, Flask realized, the folks who invented it, we don't have to reinvent the wheel of templating because some other people on the internet already created a templating library called Jinja, so we might as well use those in conjunction. And this is going to be more and more common. Even though when we started using libraries in C, they were very small and well-defined and only did one thing, once you get to web programming and really software engineering in the real world, you're going to be using multiple libraries, often in conjunction with each other, some of which are dependencies for other libraries. So we're just seeing an example of that. So this is to say, ultimately, this problem is still mine. Internal server error means I messed up. We know now from my terminal window that the template is not found. So what's the solution? Well, let's go ahead and create that template. Well, let me go back into my terminal window, but not the one with the error, but my other terminal window that gives me access to a working command prompt. Let me go ahead and type code greet.html and hit enter. And just to make the point, let me kind of pedantically type out this whole file again. So open bracket, exclamation point, doc type HTML. Then below that, HTML lang equals en. Then below that, let's put the head of this page. Inside of that, let's put the title of this page. We'll call it greet, just so I know which template is which. Then let's put the body of the page here. And then let's go ahead and do hello, comma, name, using the same placeholder as before. So in essence, my greet.html template is now what my index.html template used to be before I deleted the latter and replaced it with that interactive web form. But now, if I go back to app.py, we'll see that greet.html, which is to be rendered, should now work as intended. And I'm passing in name equals name so that I can have that template use of this placeholder substituted with the actual person's name. All right, let's cross our fingers, go back to my other tab, and reload this page. And there we have it. Hello, comma, David. Let's now go back to the code via which this current application is implemented and consider what could be done better. In fact, let me reopen my terminal window and clear it temporarily and type in ls in my templates folder, just to confirm that I do indeed have two files. Let me do cd ... ls in my hello folder, just so that you can see what files are therein. And in fact, what you see here now is a pretty representative structure for a web application implemented in Python using the Flask framework. Before long, we'll see one more folder in here, not just templates, but something called static, because up until now, we haven't served up any images, any JavaScript files, any CSS files. We can, and by convention, those such files will be stored in another folder called static. So indeed, what you're seeing here is the representative list of files and or folders that you typically need to create at some point when building a Flask application. But I dare say, even though we're following these conventions, we haven't necessarily done things the best way. Why? Well, case in point, let me hide my terminal window and open up, again, index.html. Let me go ahead and open up greet.html. And if I toggle back and forth between these, you can clearly see that they're not changing all of that much. There's a lot of commonality. The doc type at the top, the HTML tag, the head tag, the title tag, the body tag. It's really only the contents inside of the latter, head, title, and body, that are actually changing. Moreover, let me point this out. Let me go back to my user interface here. Let me go back to my web form here. And you'll see that I've zoomed in a few times, so everything's very visible. But let me go ahead and open up this feature. Let me go to right-click or control-click on my viewport. Let me click Inspect to open the developer tools that we talked about last time. And notice that I can actually click this button here at top left, which is a useful toggle for changing the type of device you're visiting a website on. So for instance, if I type this now, what you'll see, if I shrink my developer tools, you'll see a mobile version of this web page. So what that button does in Chrome, at least, and other browsers have similar features, you see what this web page would look like on a mobile device. And suffice it to say, like, I can barely tell what's on the page. Like, the default font is clearly way too small. And at least on my phone, there really is no easy way to like zoom, zoom, zoom. You can tinker with the settings, but you don't want your users having to like zoom in just to use your website. Which is to say that my website as implemented now is not responsive to the type of device that's visiting it. It is not mobile friendly. Now, there's many different ways to address this, including using libraries, but minimally, a solution to this problem typically is to go in and add an additional tag to the head of your web pages. So let me go back to index.html. Let me go into the head here, and this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to use a tag called meta, which refers to metadata. I'm going to give it an attribute called name and set that equal to viewport. Why? I'm just following the documentation. Then I'm going to specify that the content of this meta, the content for this meta tag is going to be cryptically initial-scale equals 1, comma, width equals device width. This is a mouthful, and technically I'm reading it off of a sheet of paper because I can never remember exactly what to type here. But this tag alone will make my application and my website more generally more mobile friendly. It's not going to fix all of my potential problems, but it is going to tell the browser in particular that it should size things to the specific device width, be it an iPhone, an Android device, an iPad, a tablet of some sort, or the like. And case in point, if I now go back to my other tab, which is still in my mobile view mode, let me click reload now. And notice, even though there's the tiniest of forms up there in the top corner, when I reload now it's at least more usable. Still relatively small, but it's at least readable at this point. So that one meta tag alone goes a long way to making your website responsive in the sense that things are going to be resized automatically by the browser based on the device's type. I mention that only because it's going to lead to another design opportunity. Let me close my developer tools. Let me go back to VS Code here. And you know what? My greet template still doesn't have that mobile-friendly tag. So all right, fine. Let me just save myself some keystrokes. Let me highlight this whole line 6. Let me go into greet, into its head, paste that there, and OK. Now I'd argue that I've solved this problem on this page too. But where are we going with this? Well, almost any time in CS50 when I've copied and pasted something, it's almost always been the wrong solution to a problem. It suggests a poor design because why copy paste if I can somehow factor out commonalities? And indeed, this is the point now to be made. If we toggle back and forth between these two files, index.html and greet.html, there is so much commonality. I dare say now, all of this is common from line 1 through part of line 7. All of this is common from line 15 down through line 17. Wouldn't it be nice if in HTML we can somehow factor out that code too? And here is where templates start to get very powerful, because the answer is indeed yes. We can actually factor out all of those common lines of HTML in such a way that we don't need to type them again and again. So now let me propose that we'll create one more file, even though this will allow us to make these two files simpler, as follows. I'm going to go into my terminal window where I have a command prompt. I'm going to cd back into my templates folder, and I'm going to create a new file called layout.html, which is a file name you need to adhere to when using Flask, because that's the default name, all lowercase, one word, layout.html. Enter. I've now got a new tab. I'll close my terminal window, and for the last time, hopefully, I'm going to type out doctype HTML. Then I'm going to do HTML lang equals quote unquote en. Then inside of that, I'm going to have the head of my page, inside of which I'm going to have the title of my page. And because this application doesn't really need to change that much, I'm just going to say the title for every page in this application is hello. But we could parameterize that if I wanted. I'm also, though, going to add that meta tag. So meta name equals quote unquote viewport. Content equals quote unquote initial scale equals 1, comma, width equals device width, close quote, close bracket. And then I'm going to have the body of my page. But here is where the website really varied by template. In index.html it was a form, but in greet.html it was hello so-and-so. So what I really want is a whole block of content potentially to go in here. So in fact, what I'm going to do inside of the body is use some weird looking syntax. This is more Jinja syntax. And I'm going to say this: open curly brace, %, block body, close %, close curly brace. And then with nothing in between there, I'm again going to go open curly brace, %, and this time I'm going to say end block, one word, no space, %, close curly brace. So this is weird syntax. You'll have to look it up to remember it over time, but this is the way to specify to Flask, plug in the contents of another template here. Not just a variable's value, but another file should go here. You can call this anything you want. I could call this foo or bar or baz, which are the go-to terms in computer science, but I'm going to call it body only because, one, I only have one such placeholder for now, and it's in my body, so let's just say this is the placeholder for the body of this web page. Keep it simple. So now, what can I do in my other files? Now that I have that template here, I can go back to, for instance, my index.html, and I can delete all of this. And I can delete all of this. So now in index.html is literally only the form that is going to vary for this particular page. Though I now need to tell Flask how to embed this snippet into my full layout. And the way to do that is as follows. At the top of your template, open curly brace, %, extends as a verb, quote unquote layout.html. And this is a line of saying, this is the way of saying in Flask, please extend layout.html with the contents of this file. I do need to do one more thing. I need to define the block of code that I want Flask to substitute for me. And so here too, I'm going to say block body just like I did a moment ago. And then in here, below this, I'm going to say end block. And it's weird. This is a Jinja thing. It's block space body up here, but it's just end block down here. The word end is prepended to the name of this Jinja tag. Just to be a little nitpicky, I'm going to go ahead and indent this properly, so it's only indented once there, and that's it. And admittedly, this looks a little weird, but what's important is that now I've only implemented in this file the minimum amount of HTML that differs for this particular route. What am I going to do in greet.html? Well, I'm going to delete all of this up here, and I'm going to delete all of this down here. At the top of this file, I'm again going to say extends, quote unquote, layout.html, close quote, and then another %, and close curly brace. Below that, I'm going to say block body, %, close curly. And then down here, I'm going to say, as before, end block, and close that tag. I'm going to fix the indentation here just to be consistent. And now I have a second block that will be plugged in when greet.html is used. So again, these files now differ only in terms of the contents of that block. So if I toggle back and forth here, you'll see that, and let me add spacing just for consistency here, index.html has the form, greet.html has the hello, and the placeholder for name. All right, after all of that work, let me go back to app.py, and surprise, don't need to change anything. Because I'm using the render template function, it knows not only how to handle those curly braces with variables as placeholders, it also understands curly brace percent signs, curly brace, as per the documentation for Jinja itself. So in fact, what I'm going to go ahead and do now is go back to my web page without changing anything in app.py. Just for good measure, I'll reload this page here. Wasn't expecting this to happen, but I've clearly induced a problem. I'm now getting one of these 500 internal server errors. So how do I diagnose this? Well, a good programmer would know to go back to their terminal window, go specifically to the one that's running Flask, and here we have another Jinja exception, template syntax error, expected token end of statement block got string. Now, where is that? Let's go back into my layout.html. And this looks correct. Let me go back into index.html. Super subtle. I did something dumb. Can anyone spot the mistake before I reveal? Anyone see it? Very subtle. And I think, yes, we have someone pointing it out. I stupidly forgot my double quotes. So that's all. And that's why it was seeing a string or a stir instead of the tags as it expected. So subtle, and I was holding my breath that I was actually going to be able to solve that in front of everyone, but the solution was clearly, or the hints of the solution was clearly in my terminal window. So now, let's hide my terminal window, go back to my other tab, cross my fingers, which maybe I forgot to do before, which is the problem, reload. There we go. Index.html is working, and if I type in my name and hit enter or click greet, now the whole thing is working again. But more importantly, if I view page source, notice that I indeed see that the same template has been used, the same blueprint, if you will, for this page, as well as, if we go look at the other, all of this stuff is common to these files. Now, as an aside, once you're in the browser viewing the output from the server, it's okay if not everything is pretty printed perfectly. What matters when it comes to style with web programming, as with programming in general, is what you and other developers see on the server. The browser is perfectly okay with there being less or more white space just because it was all dynamically generated. But indeed, if I go back now, not just to hello, not just to my greet route, but this one, and view page source, you'll see that what's been generated by the server is indeed almost the same up until a point. All right. So up until now, we've only been using HTTP GET requests, whereby any user input, whether it's from the form or manually typed in, is indeed being sent from browser to server via the URL itself. But it turns out there are other methods that we can use besides GET. Recall that there's also POST. And POST treats your data a little more privately in the sense that it still kind of puts it into that virtual envelope, but it shoves it down deeper such that it doesn't appear in the user's URL bar. This, of course, is compelling if it's a password, credit card, or anything personal or private. So how can we switch our own application, for instance, from using GET to using POST instead? Well, let me propose that we go back first to index.html, because it's in index.html that we explicitly specified a method of GET before. So it's very easy in HTML to change the method that this form is going to use from GET to POST. Now, weirdly, again, in HTML, you should lowercase GET and POST, even though when you see them inside the actual virtual envelope or in your developer tools, it's an uppercase GET and an uppercase POST. But that said, let's go ahead and see what happens when I make that simple change from GET to POST in my form alone. Because I've changed my HTML, I'm going to reload the page just to make sure I have the latest HTML in my browser's memory. I'm going to type my name as before, and I'm going to click greet. And notice this time that the URL is not going to display name equals David, because I've switched from GET to POST. Enter. But even though I'm ending up at /greet, and I'm not seeing name equals David, the method is not allowed. This is a weird 405 error. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out if I go into app.py, by default, when you create a route using Flask, as in line 6 or in line 11, by default, only GET is going to be supported. But if you read the documentation or follow along here, you can tell Flask what additional methods, if any, to actually support. So in fact, if I want this greet method to actually support not GET, but instead POST, what I can do is pass in a second argument, a named parameter, and say methods equals, and then pass in a Python list of methods that I want to support. If I only want to support post, I can literally just do quote unquote post. If I want to support get and post, I can do both as a comma separated list inside of this Python list. Because again, from week 6, recall that square brackets imply that this is indeed a Python list. But for now, I'm fine with just supporting post. And so I just pass in as the value of methods a list with one value, quote unquote post in all caps. All right, let's now go back to my browser tab. Let's go back to the form. Let me type in my name again, crossing my fingers, and greet. And now, oh, so close. The error is gone, but it's not greeting me. It's using that default value, hello, comma, world. Now, this makes sense at a glance because clearly there's no parameter being passed into the URL. But my code, it turns out, was assuming that if there were a parameter, it would come in via get, not via post. And this is among the weirder design decisions in Flask. But whereas get parameters are stored in request.args, as we saw, a dictionary that gives you all of those key value pairs from the URL, post requests, key value pairs, are stored in Flask using request.form. So it makes sense that they come from the form, but it's a little ambiguous, at least to me, like why we say args here and form here. You just kind of have to memorize it or look it up. Request.args is for get. Request.form is for post. The implication then is if I go back to VS Code here, it's a pretty simple change. I just have to change request.args to request.form. So I look in the right place for that key value pair. Let me go back to my other browser tab, click reload, noticing that the browser is now going to caution me, are you sure you want to resubmit this form? And that's useful because you don't want to accidentally pay for something twice on a website by submitting your credit card twice. You don't want to type in your password maybe more times than needed. And so in this, or send your password more times than needed. So the browser is cautioning me because I'm using post underneath the hood, do I actually want to resubmit this form? So yes, in this case, so I'm going to click continue. And now I do see hello, comma, David, because it's been passed in underneath the hood, if you will, inside more deeply that envelope. And we can actually see this. Let's do one other thing here. Let me go back to the form. Let me right click or control click on my viewport and click inspect to open up the developer tools. Let me go under network here and let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and type in my name and then click greet. And like last week when we were poking around all of the HTTP requests going back and forth from browser to server, let's see what the browser is actually sending. When I click greet, I indeed see that the URL at the top changed to /greet, but there's no mention of David or name. But if I go down here into my developer tools and click on that HTTP request in my log, I can now scroll down and see, the request method was apparently post. And if I scroll down further, I'll see not only the response, but if I keep going, I'll also see the request headers, which are sent inside of that envelope as well. But what I really care about in this case is payload. If I click on payload, this is a term of art that means what inputs are you sending from browser to server. You'll see a list here of all of the form data, name, David. So you can actually see in your browser's developer tools exactly what was sent. And you can do this on any website. The next time you log into a website, buy something online, you can poke around the network tab of your developer tools and see all of the key value pairs. And frankly, you're going to probably see many more values than you might have expected because browsers, of course, have lots and lots of features, more than we're implementing in these simple examples, but it's just key value pairs again and again.